this class sometimes dovetails with the sermon. It's more last week's class dovetailed with this week's sermon in terms of the, last week we talked about the Old Testament view of the land and how land was central to the nation's identity, to Israel's identity. And it just struck me again this morning how this idea of continuity, you have generational continuity, which is connected to continuity on the land, and that is connected to it's connected to order in the home, order in the family, and all of these things are deeply entwined. And God cares about these people's ability to have generational continuity, generational transmission of faith, and being connected and having continuity over time and across place. And so it just struck me again this morning that that connection between place and stability in the home and health in the home. We're going to move on from that, and we're going to talk about some other stability issues, transition issues, and we're going to look at the transition that Israel went through between being a monarchy, between being a theocracy, technically. What's a theocracy, if we define that word?
God is the king?
Yeah, God is the king. Technically, all the world is a theocracy, right? But not technically, really, all of the world is a theocracy. But the Israelites consciously lived under a quite direct relationship between themselves as a nation and God as their king. They did have a very clear mediator. We're talking about now Israel formed as a nation coming out of Egypt, right? And who is their mediator between God and the general population? It was Moses, right? And then eventually that role transitions to Joshua. And then after the nation enters the promised land, they leave 40 years of wandering and they enter in the promised land. And you have basically a generation or two of faithfulness and then a rapid decline of unfaithfulness. And then eventually the nation will, so that period of the judges lasted about 300 years, 350 years. And then Israel transitions to a monarchy. They get their first king, right? Their first king is Saul, and then they'll transfer to David, and then transition to Solomon. And this transition between being under under theocracy, directly under God, to being under a monarchy, under a king, under God, it's again, we might ask, what in the world does this have to do with 21st century politics? I think there's a lot more connection than we might initially imagine. We're going to talk about that this morning. So if you just look at it at a surface level, it might be fairly confusing looking at some different texts that we're going to look at this morning. Because at times we see God blessing the transition from a theocracy to a monarchy. And we'll look at those texts. And then at other times it seems like God is judging them for transitioning from a theocracy to a monarchy. And we're going to figure out how to harmonize those texts this morning. And Israel definitely did not navigate that transition faithfully. They navigated it unfaithfully, actually. And yet God continues to work with them as a people. So I think the first passage, we could spend a fair amount of time looking at the passage in Exodus where Moses is figuring out how to govern this unwieldy, large population of people in the wilderness, and he's really struggling to do so, right? And we might look at that later, but his father-in-law comes and talks to him about a system of delegation of responsibilities so that Moses isn't carrying the weight of the entire nation on his own shoulders. But we're gonna skip over that passage this morning, and we're gonna go to Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is the last of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, just as they're on the cusp, they're on the threshold of entering the Promised Land, right? And it's the second. Deutero means second. Onomy means law. So Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. It's the repeating of the law for everyone, the reminding of them just before they cross over into the Promised Land. So let's look at this passage. If you want to open your Bibles, it's Deuteronomy 17 and verses 14 through 20. And again, this is God's instruction to the people as they stand on the threshold of the land. And this is what he says. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, which is exactly what's going to happen. He says, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you. He must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to get many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. What stands out to you from this passage? What are some things that just kind of...
The first thing for me is where the king will write, basically write the law, write a copy of the book. I mean, what would that do for somebody?
Yeah.
Obviously, he can't deny that what God said. He can't deny he didn't hear it.
Right.
He would have written it himself. He would have been able to read it. And
right.
was supposed to read it,
And how often is he supposed to do this writing? It actually says, I think it says, all the days of his life. basically every day he's supposed to I'm sure not, some days he's out fighting a battle or something, but he's supposed to make a regular daily habit of being in God's law. It was God's word for them as they had it at that point, right? So there's a series, this begins with a series of prohibitions, and then it ends in a series of positive commands. So let's look first at the prohibitions, the negative commands. What is he told not to do? Yeah, horses. Well, what's the big deal about horses? There's people in here who like horses, right? What did horses represent, or what did they signify? What's that? Wealth, yeah, that's part of it. It's more military might, right? Horses are a military. They were the best military technology of the time, right? Horses and chariots, right?
So God wanted them to rely on him.
I think we're going to spend a morning looking at the Israel's approach to the military and to warfare, because it's really interesting. But if just think for a minute for yourselves over Israel's Old Testament history. They do a lot of fighting, but what's God's general approach to leading them into warfare, or how is their warfare distinct from the warfare of the nations around them?
He fights for them.
Yeah, that's the constant, most important theme is God will fight your battles for you. If God fights for you, it doesn't matter how powerful your opponent is. If he does not fight for you, it doesn't matter how weak they are. The only thing that really matters is God fighting for you or not, right? And so what's the idea with not going down to Egypt to get horses? There's a connection in the Old Testament between Egypt and horses and chariots. And the Philistines are like a mini Egypt. We're meant to think of them that way. And the Philistines had horses and chariots. They're in the plains, right, where horses and chariots work a lot better. Basically, the point is, your goal is not to stack up as much military might as possible to gain your security, because that's not ultimately where your security comes from, right? Okay, and then what are some of the other prohibitions? But before we go into that, because these next two are connected too, it's not just that they're failing to put their security in God, but as they go to Egypt's solutions, they tend to take on Egypt's worldview, right? And so the more they go back to Egypt looking for solutions to their problems, the more they're going to look like Egypt. And God is trying to get Egypt out of them, right? So what would that have to do with the next two prohibitions? What's the next one?
Before that actually talks about not appointing a foreigner.
Oh yeah, I forgot that one, yeah.
Generational from
Yeah.
it gets to your point as well, someone that is raised with your same belief system,
Yeah.
I'm assuming.
Well, why in the world would anyone want to appoint a foreigner? What would be the motivation for that?
Probably in that time would be probably security.
Yeah, somebody who's really good at fighting for you, right? Right. Yeah, you're going to try to find security under a foreigner if he's a real bad dude who's good at kicking butt, for you. So it's the same idea as the horses and the chariots. And surprisingly, the next one might have more to do with that than you think. What's the next prohibition? Many wives. And we think of that in terms of, we probably initially read that and think in terms of, why would a king acquire many wives? Because he likes women. But that's probably not how the original audience would have. I mean, there's an aspect of that, because of course kings like beautiful women and having lots of them. But actually, kings had the reason for marriage was primarily what at this time period? Military alliances, political alliances, right? And once again, you start marrying all of these pagan wives who serve other gods to get pagan alliances, and what happens? You're going to start following their religious systems as well, right?
Can you explain that a little bit? How does taking on a different wife equate to a political alliance? Yeah. So the way that one of the main ways, and this happened all the way up through the Middle Ages, it's probably still happening in places today. One of the main ways you built political alliances was to marry off your daughter to another king, or marry off your daughter to another king's son, or you marry another king's daughter, or you're building these. This happened in Europe a lot. It happened everywhere, really. This is
this is a time-worn thing. You're less likely to go to war with somebody. So if you're married to them, maybe you're more likely. You're less likely to. Some of these things broke down in Europe, but if you're married to, if you're France and your daughter is married to the son of Germany, you're less likely to go to war with them. But they can break down too, but it's, yeah. Yeah, so it was a way of building. So there's that, and I can't remember what my notes are. Not a foreigner, not go back to Egypt for horses, not a choir. So a king, the people saw him as the embodiment of who they were, right? He was like their champion, sort of like Goliath was their, and a king was meant to embody all of the qualities of a culture. And so virility, having lots of wives and literally hundreds of kids, that was a thing. In other words, you're showing we are a virile culture. We can reproduce, right? And so a king having 70, 80 kids, he was embodying that. But he was also, again, aligning himself with other foreign powers for the purpose of military security, right? I'll back up a bit here. So it is interesting, isn't it, that God anticipates and even seems to permit and allow for the fact that Israel is going to have a king once they enter the Promised Land, right? In a little bit, we're going to have to figure out how do we harmonize that with what we read in 1 Samuel when Samuel condemns the people for asking for a king. We'll come to that. But here God does seem to permit this idea of a future king, right? What's the next prohibition in Deuteronomy 17 for kings?
Almost like we're reading Solomon's biography.
It's almost like we're reading Solomon's biography. Yeah, that's not an accident. It's almost like Solomon went through and ticked off all of these things and did the opposite, right? And Solomon started well, but he ended poorly, right? So that's sort of a theme in the Old Testament. People starting well and finishing badly. That's David's story. That's Saul's story was starting well, ending badly. David started well, ended badly. Solomon started well, ended badly. The monarchy started well, ended badly. Right? So, Chris, you already mentioned this, not amassing for himself silver and gold. I think again, looking for security in human sources, right? Earthly sources. It doesn't say he can't have silver and gold, but it says that he. How does it word it exactly? In Deuteronomy 17. The part about silver and gold.
Nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold.
There you go. Yeah. So the word excessive, I mean, every king is going to need a treasury with silver and gold in it, and it doesn't tell for us what excessive means, but I think that's where wisdom is supposed to come into play, right? We all have to wrestle that out. If you make $30,000, you're in the top 1% of all people on the planet. So we're all sort of wealthy, but like figuring out wisely what is a good use of our resources is everybody has to work on that, right? So as Buck mentioned, Israel's kings almost totally ignore these directions. With dire consequences for themselves and for the nation. Compare this to what would have been the practices of the kings around them, or modern dictators today.
Opposite.
The opposite, right? human nature hasn't changed. If you can have all the stuff, why wouldn't you have all the stuff, right? If you can have all the women, if you can have all the money, if you can have all the might, why not, right? So from the very beginning, the idea that God gives for them of monarchy is radically different from the view of monarchy of the pagan countries around them, right? And again, we have this idea that our modern political systems, which are to the extent that they're still healthy and stable, we have the idea that these are just simply because of human progress and the Enlightenment. But it's just historically not true. I mean, it's the countries, it's the nations that came into contact with the Word of God and the gospel that were shaped by these ideas. And they didn't just start with Jesus. They actually started in the Old Testament. God's view of governance was radically different for his people in the Old Testament than it was for the people around them. And Jesus is a continuation of that tradition. He's a fulfillment of that tradition. But Old Testament Israel had a view of governance that was radically different from the nations around them. And we see that in their monarchy as well. So what are some of the positive? You've already touched on this, but what are some of the positive commands that the king is given? Here, it's right here in front of us. When he sits on the throne, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by Levitical priests, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them. What stands out to you from that first part of this command?
When we learn the fear of God, and you do that by keeping the words of laws and
Right.
statutes and
Right. How would this approach to kingship be different from the pagan kings around them?
Pagan kings thought they were God.
Right. They thought they were gods, and therefore they could set the law however they want, right? And this king, Israel's kings, are clearly meant to be under the law, not above the law. Like tyrants, dictators, they're above the law. This clearly places the king below the law. That's a crucial difference in societies that submit to a Christian tradition versus those who don't submit to a Christian tradition. Right.
Can you almost see them in that position as a teacher rather than a ruler?
Mm-hmm. There's definitely, when you think about what an Old Testament pagan king would do, this wouldn't be on his daily to-do list, right? Right. It's a very different vision of what kingship is.
To me, even with the, not only did he write for himself a book or a copy, but he's also, that's approved by the Levitical priests. So he's got a board here.
That's a really good point. So he is accountable to the priests who are also accountable to the law, but their job is to understand it. And these guys are looking over his shoulder to make sure pagan kings didn't have anybody looking over their shoulder, keeping them accountable for anything, right? That's it seems like a little detail, but it's a really important detail. We'll look at that more as we go forward. We'll look at the relationship between Nathan and the prophet David. And I was reading this morning in 1 Kings, the transition from David to Solomon. It was all of these transitions. Kingship transition has always been fraught, partly because kings have lots and lots of sons, generally. And so which one of them is going to become the next king. And there's usually not a clear line of succession for choosing. You see this in North Korea, like I think Kim Jong-il was like the third or fourth son, and he bumped off the first, second, and third son. So this is a perennial human problem, right? This really hasn't changed. So these transitions of leadership are hard. And in 1 Kings, when they're trying to figure out which one of David's sons is going to be the next king, I think is it Abijah? He gets a priest and a prophet to come to him. But Solomon's got his rival. He's got the true priest and the true prophet, Nathan, with him. So they're this connection to the role of priest and prophet is really important in Old Testament kingship. Yeah, you just mentioned this. Note the role of the priests providing accountability to the king. He's not a god on earth. He actually has many checks and balances. And then this passage closes with this phrase, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers. That's an interesting way of referring to his countrymen. That he may not turn aside from the commandment, that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Does that set off any echoes in your head from this morning? Right, it's the same. So some of the best students of the book of Deuteronomy, one theme that's constantly hammered home through Deuteronomy is Israel is God's son, right? Israel, the nation, is God's son. And so you get this idea that the king is like the family's, he's like the firstborn of the sons, right? He's the older brother, I mean, in a good sense, right? The older brother had a lot of responsibility. He had, right? But they're all brothers, right? Your king is not he's not your daddy. He's your older brother, which is a key difference, right? And so this is a repetition of the fifth commandment. You see the echo of the fifth commandment in here. If the king honors his father, who's God, then the whole country is going to live long on the land that God has given you, right? This fifth commandment with a promise that Zeke talked about this morning. Does that make sense? Right? That he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children. This idea of continuity and stability that comes from not military might, but it comes from faithfulness to God and God's law, right?
It's fascinating that there's no admonishment of the people to honor the king or anything. That's like all just understood, that as we honor God, we honor his next authority, because he's here for our good. Right. It parallels the passage from Ephesians 6 this morning, right? Yeah, if the king honors God and the people honor the king, then everything is in its proper order. Of course, we know how it turns out in Israel and how it sometimes turns out in our families too, right? But, any other thoughts on this? So, we mentioned this. The king is more like an older brother than a god, right? Or a father, right? God is the father. The king is the older brother of his younger brothers, his people. Right? Let's see. Yeah, the multiple failures of Israel's kings will eventually lead to a situation where the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, are looking for one final king, one true king, one faithful king who will actually rule in perfect union with God, which their earthly kings never managed to do. We get a few kings who who are called faithful, but the vast majority of Israel's kings are condemned by God as not walking with God, right? So they move into the promised land. That's the book of Judges. The book of Joshua is the conquest of the promised land. And it begins well as they enter the promised land. It goes well there's a phrase in Joshua about the first generation or the first and second generation are faithful to God. But then that generation dies and God's law is not transmitted. Our generational problems are not new today, right? It's always been a challenge to transmit the faith from one generation to the next. And so the book of Judges, you could make a case that the book of Judges is the darkest, most awful book of the Bible. It really is a horrific car wreck of a book. One long series of failures, and it gets darker and darker as it goes along. And the last episode of the book of Judges is just this awful train wreck of a story. But also, as the book rolls along, this one phrase keeps popping up, and it becomes like the chorus of the book. And it's real short. It says, "In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." That phrase pops up in chapter 17, chapter 18, chapter 19, and chapter 21. And it's the very last sentence of the book of Judges is, "In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." That's the thesis statement of the book, right? So what does that teach us about, what do we learn about kingship or political implications of that statement?
Leadership does matter.
Yeah,
I mean, we're put together to follow,
yeah,
whether it's the perfect situation God or someone that is in leadership. Right? Everyone did what's right in their own eyes. I mean, boy, we're knocking on that pretty good right now.
right,
You know, when we don't, regardless of who is in authority,
right,
the general theme is to push back on it
right,
and to do what you want.
right,
We have professors in schools that you can argue they didn't give you the right grade.
right,
You know, change the grade. I mean,
right.
seems like we're in that era again.
Yeah,
Is my remembering this right, Nathan, that in each of those instances, though, didn't they kind of get to the end of it, oh, this is a disaster, and then people asked again for a leader? Is that right?
well, you have this cycle in Judges where the people get they fall into unfaithfulness, and then they get enslaved, usually by the Philistines or some other neighbor, and this Egypt slavery thing gets repeated over and over, right? And then they cry out to God for help, and then God sends them a deliverer. They repent temporarily, God sends them a deliverer, delivers them militarily, and then they have a few years of faithfulness, and then they just run right off the tracks again, right?
Even when they finally ask for a king, it isn't until Samuel acted as their de facto king for however long.
Samuel's considered the last judge, basically.
And then after his tenure, he starts getting old, right? And so he sets his sons up to take over for him.
And
they're corrupt.
They're worthless, yeah.
And that's
They're having
why
sex in
Israel
the
asked for
temple
king.
with, yeah. They're having sex in the temple,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so Samuel thinks that they're asking for a king because of his failures, and God's like, no, it's me they're rejecting, not you.
Yeah, so let's go to that passage next, because that's next. The final story of Judges is just a complete disaster of a story, and involves civil war and the near extermination of one of Israel's tribes, not only not living on the land, but almost being completely exterminated, right? So, Mark, you touched on this. No king seems to be a clear condemnation of anarchy. Monarchy means the rule of one, a king, monarchy. What does anarchy literally mean? Any Latin students back there? What is anarchy? Anarchy. Means Zaid, you know what I know you. No? Okay. It means rule by none. A means literally no rule. So it's literally nobody's in charge, right? No one in charge. Everyone does what he feels like. Everyone does what's right in his own eyes, right? That was a great little picture that Zeke used this morning of the boy on the airplane with his phone, right? Literally, no one is in charge. And the boy's doing what's right in his own eyes, right? So the only thing worse than tyranny is anarchy, where every man becomes his own tyrant, right? That's Haiti right now, actually, it's anarchy. So this sets the stage. Judges rolls seamlessly right into 1 Samuel. And 1 Samuel is going to be this transition from you say theocracy, but really a godless anarchy. The shambles of theocracy to a monarchy. This is just an aside, but this is pretty strong evidence that Judges was written at a pretty early date, after probably early in the reign of David, or perhaps early in the reign of Solomon. Why would we suggest that from this phrase? There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Just a little bit of logic there.
Obviously, this is different than what it is.
Yeah, it's different because now there is a king in Israel, but it must have been under one of the better kingship environments, because the idea is if there had been a king, he wouldn't have put up with this crap like was going on there, right? Yeah. Not just any old king, but a good king. The implications that there had there been a good king in Israel, he wouldn't have put up with this evil described in the book of Judges. Later on, in 1st and 2nd Kings, the kings are going to originate much of the evil themselves. So God's plan was always to run his plan of redemption through David as a type of the future Messiah. Does anybody wonder, why would God make such a big deal out of David and David's monarchy as a type of the coming Messiah? This is the realm of speculation.
I think in part because it gives us a frame of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's less abstract.
Yeah.
On Wednesday nights at youth group, we're going through Matthew, and the people latch onto Jesus as king, which they still get that. They still interpret that.
Which they were right to latch onto him as king. Yeah.
Right. But they almost get there. But they think of it in terms of an earthly kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And we still mess it up, but it gets us closer than just having it being totally abstract.
Right. That's my speculation too, is that God on this earth gives us physical objects which he created, which are meant to be a window into understanding non-physical realities, right? So knowing what a king is and what a king does, and particularly a good king, that helps us to imagine better who Jesus is and what Jesus does. Yeah, Newton.
A non
Yeah, types and shadows of the real.
And
Yeah.
it's just amazing to me. I mean, it's just, it has me shaking my head almost every time I see it, that the real sacrifice, I mean, the visible sacrifices, the visible temple was not the real sacrifice.
There were road signs pointing to the real thing. Yeah.
It was not the real sanctuary.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
180 degrees from where I think the real thing ought to be.
But it's God's kindness to give us these visual markers, right, to help us understand concepts that if we didn't have a physical world, we'd have a hard time visualizing these things, right? He gives us the ceremony of baptism to help us understand what rebirth means, right? He gives us the Lord's Supper to help us, as a physical reminder, to help us remember what the true sacrifice was, right? He gives us, if God has given you a good earthly father, that helps you visualize what a good heavenly father is like, right? Of course, it can work the opposite way too. If you have an evil earthly father, it's going to be a lot harder to picture what a good God looks like. Moving into 1 Samuel now, and this is the birth of the monarchy, and it's not great beginnings. So this is reading from 1 Samuel 8. So then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways." It's one of the tragedies. A lot of the great men in the Old Testament had lousy sons, which is a tragedy. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations, which is almost an exact phrase from Deuteronomy 17, right? He says, you're going to ask for a king like the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you." Democracy, yay, right? For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. What do you notice from? We'll keep going on in this passage, but what do you notice from this first paragraph? Buck, you already mentioned a lot of the key points. Yeah, right. They are rejecting Samuel's leadership, but they're not wrong to recognize that his sons were lousy leaders. Moving on in 1 Samuel 8. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He'll take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He'll take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He'll take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Somebody was talking about the growth of just the size of Washington, D.C. in the past 30 years. It used to be a pretty small town, and now it's this. This is a good description of how it got so big. Right. People have figured out how to milk the system to take for themselves, right? What else do you notice?
It's interesting that from the Deuteronomy passage, it's obvious that for them to have a king was God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
And for the Messiah to be the king and the high priest was obviously God's plan. And here, this reads at the end, almost like Proverbs, when wisdom is saying to the person who rejects wisdom, I'm going to mock you when your fear comes. I'm going to laugh at you when you're struck by calamity. Don't look to me for help in that day. You're on your own. And that's kind of the way this reads. Is, I'm not going to answer you. You'll cry out to me.
You made your bed, sleep in it. Yeah. Right.
And
And yet God actually,
that's God's
God
plan.
doesn't actually abandon them. Right. He judges that. Well, he's the good father who, loving and delighting in his children, disciplines them, right, with a rod of exile. Yeah.
And the irrationality of their response is, bring it on. I'll vote for that.
Yeah.
How God is rational as we are these days.
Yeah, here's what you're saying. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. It's going to be awesome. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. I personally am very happy to live under a democracy. I think it's the best system we have. But democracy doesn't solve everything. Hitler was voted as the leader of Germany in 1933 by a legal vote. So just the will of the people doesn't necessarily guarantee that everything's going to be awesome all the time, right? Sometimes we get the leaders we deserve. And more so in a democracy. We can't blame anybody else for it. This almost reads like a libertarian treatise against big government, right? He's going to take all your stuff. This is all about taxes, right? What is the problem? This is a little bit hard to tease out. What is the problem? If Deuteronomy 17 said it was okay to have a king, what's the problem with their asking for a king?
They rejected God.
They rejected God. And what's their motivation? We see a lot of their motivation in this last, this last paragraph tells us a lot of their motivation, or how they're asking for a king, or why they're asking for a king. We want to be like the people around us, because they look like they're secure, they're doing well.
Well, and having the king fight their battles again is no longer acknowledging that it was God fighting the battles that got them where they were.
Right. And there's probably a little bit of self-deceit going. The king's not actually going to fight your battles, you're going to fight them for him. Right? The king's not going to be out in the on the front lines.
But having this come through just a horrific
Yeah.
time period where
Like-
the nation got
Yeah.
slaughtered.
Yeah, they're like, anything's got to be better than this.
Right, you can see how they got there, they did not put their faith in the right spot.
But they didn't take the right lessons from the book of Judges. They took the wrong lessons, right? They would just need somebody who's stronger, who can fight our battles for us, right? Are we ever tempted to think of politics that way? We just need somebody who's going to fix our problems for us. This is what campaign speeches are based on. Is this kind of self-deceit of the people. right? He's gonna fix everything. He told us he would. He promised he would. Right.
We're also that quickly to hear that and not discern it.
Right. Right.
We're like the people of Israel. It's like, no, they've been told that that's not going to actually truly fix their issues, but it's like, no,
Right.
maybe this time it will.
Right. Yeah.
Chuck Colson said, salvation does not come on Air Force One.
Comes in the clouds, but not on Air Force One, right? That's good.
He didn't say it, but of course, the intent was, it never comes on Air Force One.
Yeah.
Ever.
Which is not to say that good leadership doesn't matter, or that's not what you're saying, but good leadership, I mean, this tells us good leadership is really, really, really important. But yeah, we're easily suckered into into bad leadership, right? So rather the problem lies with their demand for a king like all the nations, and that he's going to solve our problems, right? He's going to fight our battles. And God tells them in verse 8, you continually forsake me for other gods. That's your basic problem. Your basic problems are idolatry, not the Philistines. Right? So the real problem is they've abandoned God. They're in trouble, but they don't want to return to God. They want to find their own solution by imitating their pagan neighbors. If Israel's kings had followed the directions of Deuteronomy 17, they wouldn't need to do all of the taking in 1 Samuel 8, right? And this word take, it's the exact same verb that's used, and it says David took Bathsheba. It's actually the same verb that's used when Adam and Eve took the fruit. It's a really interesting verb that shows up at really poignant times in the Old Testament. So God gives them the king they asked for. He's young, he's tall, dark, and handsome. He comes from a wealthy family. What's not to like? Everybody's excited. Everybody cheers. And then here's 1 Samuel 12. This is Samuel. Once they have their king, Samuel's having like a coronation ceremony, and he gives an address to the people. He says, "Behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king." And that's not actually any different from today, right? It seems like if they faithfully follow God, probably just about any governmental system would work. If they stray from God, no governmental system is going to work. So they get a king. Saul starts out well. Goes off the rails, descends into actual madness. Even so, David is very, very reluctant to grab the throne for himself, even when it's like put right in front of him. You think of those episodes when he has Saul in the cave and Saul sleeping, and he twice cuts off a piece of his garment when all of his men are saying, "Dude, kill this guy. He's trying to kill you." And David puts a very high value, but higher than probably any of us would ever do, on the fact that God did choose Saul, and David is not going to seize that before it's time. So Saul actually dies, not at the hand of David. Saul dies in battle with the Philistines, and David is crowned king and by Samuel. And David establishes his throne in Jerusalem and brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And it's one of the most triumphant passages when David comes into Jerusalem with the Ark as king, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And then shortly after that, probably within a year or two, maybe in the same year, we don't know exactly, but we have one of the most crucial passages in the Old Testament, and that's 2 Samuel 7, and that's the Davidic covenant, the covenant that God makes with David, the new king. And this is everything kind of idealized and shiny and new. And God says to David, "The Lord will make you a house." And house there means like a kingdom, a dynasty would be a word for it. "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son." I really don't think David knew what God was talking about. He believed it, but I don't think he knew. What's this really talking about? This isn't Solomon. In a sense, it's Solomon, but it's Solomon is, again, something. The best of Solomon is pointing to something far better, far more glorious, right? What's this ultimately? The best of Israel's monarchy is pointing toward what? The king the anointed one, the Messiah, who will come, whose house and kingdom will be made sure forever, right? And it is literally through David's line that the Messiah comes. And this is such a crucial passage because it's a critical link in redemption history, and it's like God opened up a whole new page a whole new scroll and said, "This is where I'm going," in a way that was not understood before. So David was born in Bethlehem in obscurity and became a king. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in obscurity and became a king. David rode triumphantly into Jerusalem on a donkey as king. Jesus rode triumphantly into Jerusalem on a donkey as king.
Cut and paste works then.
David exited Jerusalem weeping through the Mount of Olives. Jesus exited Jerusalem weeping through the Mount of Olives. None of these are accidental signs, right? And yet, as Hebrews, you mentioned Hebrews already, as it constantly reminds us, Jesus came to establish a kingdom far greater than anything David ever imagined, I think. And how could he? How could he know? But here's a takeaway, I think for modern times. Israel's kings are not given nearly as much leash as the pagan kings around them. They're authorized to rule by deity, just like the pagan kings thought themselves as authorized by deity. However, that's where the similarities stop. Israel's kings are reined in by heaven. They're held accountable by heaven. Whereas pagan kings were set loose to do whatever they wanted. Modern people would generally think of biblical views as superstitious, ancient, worn out, irrelevant, right? Particularly linking an earthly ruler's link to the divine. But secular, quote unquote, secular modern people are very quick to invest our leaders with magical powers to change the climate or the weather. If we're in an election year, you're going to hear politicians tell us that that their policies will change the weather. To bring about world peace, to solve everyone's problems without raising any taxes, to stamp out all injustice. Just a heads up, all of the campaign's promises you're going to hear this year are mostly, well, there's a word for it, but we're in church, so it's mostly untrue, right? People do not have the ability to solve these perennial human problems, right? That's a good stopping place. What final thoughts do you have?
Did they ever set up a foreigner as a leader?
They definitely attempted a lot of alliances with foreign powers. I don't know that they ever, can anybody think of did they ever actually install a king who was a foreigner? I can't, not that I can think of, but they definitely went back to Egypt for horses a lot. And they definitely, Solomon had hundreds of wives, and many of them were, well, David's, one of the ways David went wrong is his first son, this is Absalom, who, the first one who tried to do a coup, was actually the son of his mother was the daughter of a foreign king. So he had, and when his coup failed, he went back to their foreign country for his support. So that sword cuts both ways, right? Yeah.
Is David's treatment of Saul supposed to be a model? Like, is that an example, or is that just how he was?
I think it's held up as an attempt at a genuine attempt at faithfulness, not as a failure of nerve or failure of courage, but as a genuine attempt to be faithful because God set this person up, and so I'm not going to touch God's anointed. Ironically, David's own sons several times tried to kill him to take the throne. Yeah, they didn't have the same respect for their father that he showed for Saul. Yeah.
And respect for the throne and the right.
For the position, yeah. And for God, ultimately for the God who set him up. Yeah.
But that's the thing is none of the kings had sons that respected them throughout the entire history of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And how much of that is cultural? How much was that of them being bad parents? And we don't know.
Right.
Why?
There's definitely a pattern.
All their sons followed the Lord.
Yeah.
Any righteous king had bad sons.
Right.
And in God's mercy, many wicked kings had righteous sons.
Yeah. Yeah, you hardly ever see a winning streak of several generations in a row. Maybe the closest you come is David and Solomon, but that's got its problems too.
I'm struck again with Manasseh. Manasseh was like the third to last king of Judah, and he is the most wicked of all of the kings.
And he has
the account in Kings, it just tells how wicked he was, and he died.
And he has a righteous son.
Well, when you read the account, he became king at age 12 and reigned 55 years. When you read the account in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, it says that he was taken away captive with hooks in his nose. He's carried away. He cries out to God, and God brings him back and he becomes king again, which is quite fascinating.
Right.
Because his sins were why, when Hezekiah repented, God had no mercy. Israel was judged because of the sins of all the kings, but because Manasseh's sin was the worst.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating in the grace of God that he accepted his personal repentance.
Yeah.
The sins of the nation were still to be judged.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think where we miss it sometimes, though, is we can look at that, and it seems like there is certainly a pattern that if you have leadership that does have a value oriented towards God, that things for your country will go better.
Absolutely, yeah.
For sure.
That's
But
clear, yeah.
I think the failure sometimes today in our churches is that we still put too much faith in that leadership. And I think we inappropriately give them too much power. And that's not maybe leadership's problem. I think that's our problem. We're responsible for all the things that our sphere of influence in the church, everything we do on the local level. And we need leadership because it's clear when there is no leadership, things go poorly too. But when we put too much of our faith in leadership, and then we get let down, and then we cry about leadership when it foul. Well, we're the ones that put all this authority to a degree, but still knowing that if good leaders can change things.
Right.
But how much we appropriate to them is really something that we do in our hearts.
Right.
That I think we miss pretty often.
One of our goals for this whole class is that we would, one, expand our view of what is political to really what is social, right? These political problems are social problems that aren't solved by an election, but also to just simply be less idolatrous about politics, right? To invest less of our identity and our hope and our disappointment or our excitement in four-year election cycles. Again, that's not to say that good leadership and bad leadership doesn't matter. It matters a lot, but it's not where our highest hope should be set, right? Salvation doesn't come on Air Force One, even if the guy in Air Force One is fantastic, right? Even if he's able to fulfill all the promises that he made, which he won't be able to. I don't care what party he's from. Well, that's probably a good place to close. Mark, would you close in prayer?